So after uploading 50 HDR videos to YouTube, was it worth it? What are the pros and cons, and should you upload in HDR? Let's talk about it. How's it going, y'all? It's Ben, Aqua, and yeah, this is actually my 51st HDR video. I can definitely say there have been some ups and downs related to it, mostly ups though. So what even is HDR video and why should we care? HDR, or high dynamic range television, is a technology that improves the quality of display signals. HDR changes the way the luminance and colors of videos and images are represented in the signal and allows brighter and more detailed highlight representation, darker and more detailed shadows, and a wider array of more intense colors. HDR allows compatible displays, which is a huge thing, we'll talk about that in a bit, to receive a higher quality image source. Not all HDR displays have the same capabilities, and HDR content will look different depending on the display used. So basically HDR looks amazing, you get more colors, you get more dynamic range, and I love that aspect of HDR, and that's the main reason why I have been pushing myself to upload all these videos in HDR. And as the Wikipedia was saying, if you have an HDR compatible display, which should have a huge asterisk on it because there are so many different types of displays, even the one you're watching right now, is it HDR compatible? I'm of course a huge Apple nerd, so most of the more recent Apple devices from the last few years do support HDR video. And especially if you have a newer Apple device like the M1 iPad Pro 12.9 inch that supports that really high brightness HDR. It's so juicy, it looks so good. Or even an iPhone starting with the iPhone 11 Pro and the other Pro models after that. Or the MacBook Pro 14 inch, which is where I actually edit and view a lot of HDR content. There's so many other displays that obviously are not Apple. There's so many other TVs and monitors for your computer. A lot of them will say HDR, but they're all built a little bit differently. I love Apple displays, but even how I see it on my MacBook Pro, for example, will be different than my Sony OLED A80J display in the background over there. The colors will look a little bit different, the color calibration will look a little different. Without getting too scientific, basically HDR looks amazing as long as your display supports it and if it's a really good quality display as well. Sometimes, especially with displays, you kind of get what you pay for. So if you go kind of cheap and it says HDR, it doesn't always support the full dynamic range and it won't always look the same on that display versus like an Apple display. And that to me is one of the biggest cons of uploading in HDR. Your video is always gonna look a little different on all these different displays. It could look all kinds of janky, and I'm talking about orange skin tones, like blown out highlights and shadows being too dark with no detail. It's kind of a crapshoot. You're kind of throwing this HDR content out there, just hoping and wishing, #thoughts and prayers, that your HDR video will look good. So the difference between SDR and HDR is dramatic, especially if you have one of these displays that supports that higher dynamic range and that extra brightness and stuff like those Apple displays. Then you will notice a gigantic difference, in my opinion, from HDR content versus SDR. But also I would say like 97% of videos I watch on YouTube are in SDR and it doesn't really bother me. But when an HDR video turns on, all of a sudden the brightness on the display goes up and the colors look richer and more vibrant and it feels a little more immersive to me. So for me, HDR is worth uploading to YouTube, but it does get a little complicated when you're filming your video, when you're editing your video, when you're exporting, and then when you're uploading to YouTube. It's honestly kind of a pain in the ass. Worth it, but it's annoying. And it's kind of unpredictable. Let me explain. Starting with the recording process, HDR starts getting complicated. The easiest thing to do is literally just whip out your iPhone if it's from the last few years, set it to HDR and start recording, and you're kind of done. But if you want to shoot on a mirrorless camera or a bigger camera, like I'm using the Sony a7 IV to film this right now, you have to make sure you're shooting in the right modes. So I can make a whole other video about this, I probably will, talking about my settings to shoot HDR, but you can't just turn on your camera and press record unless you have these HDR settings ready to go. And luckily a lot of cameras will let you save settings, so I can basically turn on my camera. I already am shooting in what's called an HLG color space, which is kind of like a raw video color mode. And then I take that video, throw it into my laptop, and that takes that raw HDR-y video in Final Cut Pro and kind of converts it into an HDR video. And then in Final Cut Pro, editing is actually not that different from SDR to HDR, but you do have to pay particular attention to how the colors and the details and the shadows and stuff are officially rendered on your screen. This is where it starts getting a little tricky from the creator standpoint, because again, not all displays are created equal. So I'll be editing streaming on my MacBook Pro 14-inch, it looks incredible. But then if you hook up a monitor that does not support HDR or has kind of a virtual HDR setup, it might kind of look like trash. So you're kind of crossing your fingers at this point, like, oh my God, I hope this looks really good on all displays. But honestly, it kind of won't. And that part is definitely frustrating. And another frustrating part is when you're filming video in HDR or in a more uncompressed raw format like HLG, you're using way more battery life than you would shooting a normal SDR video, because it's literally taking in a ton more detail and color information. And that also translates to how much HDR video editing just completely annihilates my MacBook Pro 14-inch battery. It may last maybe 2 hours with heavy HDR editing, but luckily, since the MacBook Pro is supercharged with that M1 Pro chip, it handles the HDR video files swimmingly, even shot in 10-bit HLG. It's buttery smooth, the editing process is no big deal. However, that's kind of another potential con, is if you don't have a more recent computer of some variety, HDR videos do have a lot more information. The files are huge. It's drawing a lot more battery life. So you're gonna need kind of a super powered computer. And then once the editing is done in Final Cut, it looks good, it's ready to go. Then you have to export it, which also is kind of a tricky situation. Depending on which video editing app you're using, the software will be a little bit different in your export settings. I use the kind of default export to Apple device 4K HDR setting in Final Cut Pro, and to me it looks phenomenal, and it keeps the file size kind of down using the H.265 compression format. What that means in human terms is it'll look amazing, your video will be in HDR, it's gonna be ready for YouTube. But that's where there's another potential caveat, that I think this might actually be the biggest thing that will deter you and me sometimes even from doing all of this HDR stuff, and that is YouTube processing times. YouTube can take its sweet time sometimes at processing these HDR videos. Sometimes it takes at least 24 hours, sometimes it takes like a week. I even had one video that never has processed, like even to this day. It's like almost a year old and it's still in SDR, and I don't think it's ever gonna process. For it to not show up ever as HDR is like, why, YouTube, why? But it seems like the average processing time for HDR video, at least in my experience, has been about 24 hours, sometimes less, sometimes a lot more. So if your workflow requires like really fast uploads and then you want to get that into 4K or at least 1080p as quickly as possible, HDR might not be for you, because honestly, these processing times can be kind of annoying sometimes, especially when there's like a product launch and you want to be right there, you know, you have your video ready to go, but then you're kind of like, all right, here we go. Any day now, YouTube. But I will say that once it's processed in HDR on YouTube, it looks awesome. What you see on YouTube is pretty similar to your compressed file. So after all of this HDR mess, is HDR actually worth it? For me, absolutely yes. It looks so much better than SDR video in my opinion. You just get so much richer colors and brighter contrast ratios. The juicy details in the shadows are not lost. The highlights aren't all just like a clipping mess. Like, you see so much more color variation, so much more detail. And if you do it right, I think it exudes a huge amount of quality and just looks fantastic. And I think uploading in HDR kind of future-proofs your videos, because so many displays these days are moving towards HDR and higher resolution style displays. The technology advances so rapidly, so if you have your HDR video already on YouTube, when someone gets that new fancy display or their new iPhone or whatever, they will see your video in beautiful HDR, very close to how you wanted it to be represented. So for me, the future-proofing and just the beauty of an HDR video on a really nice HDR display, that to me makes HDR totally worth all of the pain and chaos and the kind of unpredictability of the uploading process and the processing times on YouTube. That like anxiety of how is this gonna look on all these different displays, you're kind of just crossing your fingers at a lot of times, but I still think it's really worth it. But if you have anxiety about filming an HDR video, editing one, exporting it, uploading it to YouTube, getting it processed properly, and making it look identical on all screens, which it kind of never will, to be honest. If you're feeling like, I don't know about this, I would just suggest keeping to SDR videos and not even messing with HDR. Most, if not all, of the biggest YouTubers don't even use HDR, so it's not a huge deal if you choose SDR over HDR. And with SDR video, there is a higher chance that your video will look kind of the same on most displays, even HDR ones. So there's not that guessing game of like, how is this gonna look on that display versus that one? But let me know in the comments what you think. Do you upload in HDR HDR? Are you thinking about it? Do you prefer HDR over SDR, or do you like to do SDR videos? Sound off in the comments and smash the like button if you made it all the way to the end of the video, and let me know that by leaving a pizza emoji in the comments below. I really appreciate you watching this whole video. Be sure to subscribe on your way out, and I'll see you in the next video.